In the boundless, snow-draped forests of Canada, the sky hung heavy with the cold grey tones of winter, casting a sombre veil over the landscape as though the heavens themselves mourned in silence. Snowflakes floated down in a slow, hypnotic dance, each one catching on the bristling needles of ancient pine trees before settling onto the ever-thickening blanket that cloaked the forest floor. The air was sharp and biting, and an icy wind wove its way through the towering trees, rattling their branches and sending faint whispers of sound echoing through the wilderness, a haunting melody of nature's indifference. In the midst of this vast, unforgiving expanse, an old wolf named Ragnar moved forward, his steps heavy and deliberate, each one a testament to a body worn by time. Ragnar had once reigned as the fearless sovereign of these wilds. For countless seasons, he had safeguarded his pack with unwavering resolve, guiding them through the fiercest blizzards and leading hunts that sustained them against the odds. In his prime, his coat had been a magnificent tapestry of silver and white, thick and lustrous, rippling like liquid moonlight as he bounded across the snow. His eyes had burned with a fierce, unyielding clarity, twin daggers that could spot a hair's twitch from 100 yards away. His powerful frame had exuded authority, muscles taut beneath his fur, paws that gripped the earth with purpose, and a howl so resonant it could stir the forest into a symphony of response. But time, relentless and cruel, had stripped him of that vigor. Now his coat was sparse and faded, patches of bare skin peeking through where once there had been splendor. His eyes, dulled by age, struggled to pierce the gloom, and his bones jutted sharply beneath his thinning hide. A young, ambitious male wolf had challenged him under a frost-bitten sky, and in that brutal clash, Ragnar had fallen. Defeated and cast out, solitude became his companion that night, a shadow that clung to him as he retreated into the frozen unknown. For a wolf, solitude was a death sentence whispered on the wind. The pack's strength had once made survival a shared triumph. Together, they could bring down a deer with precision and feast as one. Now, alone, such prey was a distant mirage, taunting him from beyond his reach. Hunger had become a constant tormentor. His stomach hollowed out, clinging desperately to his spine. His body withered with every sunrise, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. Walking, once a fluid motion of power, was now a laborious task. His legs quaked beneath him, his breath escaping in short, labored bursts that fogged briefly in the frigid air before vanishing. In recent days, as he plodded through the deepening snow, he left behind shallow tracks, fragile imprints that the wind and falling flakes quickly erased, as if the forest conspired to forget him entirely. Even when Ragnar mustered the will to hunt, his old speed had forsaken him. His vision blurred at the edges, turning the world into a haze of shapes and shadows. His teeth, once capable of crushing bone, now faltered, too weak to hold a struggling catch. Each failed attempt chipped away at his strength, his spirit teetering on the edge of despair. Yet surrender wasn't in his nature. Instead of fighting with the ferocity that had once defined him, he sought a sliver of hope, a chance to endure just one more day. As he trudged onward, his nose lifted to the air, sniffing for the faintest hint of carrion or the fleeting scent of a rabbit. His ears, though less keen, twitched at every rustle, every crack of a twig under snow. The forest, vast and silent, offered him no mercy, its stillness a stark contrast to the life it once held for him. It was during this bleak time that Elena and Noah, two wildlife researchers dedicated to the region, first spotted Ragnar wandering alone. They had spent years immersed in these snowy woods, their lives woven into the fabric of the wild. Clad in thick parkas, they'd huddle by flickering campfires at night, steam rising from their mugs as they pored over maps and journals. By day, they'd trek through the snow, binoculars pressed to their eyes, tracking the movements of wolves, deer, and the elusive lynx. Their work was fueled by a deep respect for the creatures they studied, a quiet passion to understand and protect. But Ragnar was different. When they first glimpsed him through the frost-laden trees, his gaunt frame and halting steps struck them like a blow. They set up a vantage point on a low ridge, watching him over days as he grew visibly weaker. His fate was clear. He'd either succumb to starvation or fall to a predator's jaws, a bear roused from hibernation, perhaps, or a younger wolf eager to prove itself. This inevitability gnawed at Elena and Noah, stirring a pang of sorrow they couldn't shake. Even as they knew the wild rarely spared the frail, resolved to intervene, they crafted a careful plan. Approaching Ragnar was a gamble. His weakened state didn't dull the wildness in his blood. If he perceived them as a threat, he could summon one last surge of strength to attack. Trust was their first step, a bridge they'd have to build with patience. Helena knelt in the snow, her breath visible as she pulled a chunk of fresh meat from her pack. She placed it gently on the icy ground, her gloved fingers trembling from the cold but steady in purpose. Ragnar froze, stepping back with a wary glint in his eyes, then raised his muzzle to catch the scent. Hunger warred with instinct, and hunger won. He crept forward, pausing to sniff the offering before tearing into it with small, cautious bites. Elena and Noah held their breath, their hearts pounding in unison as they watched this fragile breakthrough unfold. "Now?" Noah whispered, his voice barely a ripple in the stillness, his hand hovering near their equipment. "Not yet," Elena murmured, her eyes locked on Ragnar. "He needs more time. We rush this, and he'll bolt." For days they tended to him, with quiet dedication. Each morning they'd rise before dawn, boots crunching through fresh snow as they followed his faint trail. They left modest portions of meat at intervals, retreating to observe from a distance as he ate. At first he'd snatch the food and vanish into the forest's depths, his form swallowed by the shadows of the pines. But slowly he adjusted to their presence. The sight of them no longer sent him fleeing. Instead, he'd linger, head tilted, watching them with a mix of wariness and weary acceptance. Helena saw in his gaze a profound tiredness, tempered by a flicker of something softer, perhaps a reluctant trust. One frigid morning, as the sky glowed faintly with the promise of light, they made their move. With practiced precision, they approached, and injected him with a mild sedative. Ragnar stiffened, a low growl rumbling from his chest, but the drug took hold swiftly. His legs buckled, his eyes fluttered shut, and he slumped into the snow, a fallen king at rest. They carried him with care to a sturdy crate designed for transport. Noah, lifting Ragnar's frail body, muttered, "He's lighter than I imagined. Hard to believe he was ever a leader." Elena ran her hand along his patchy coat, feeling the ridges of his ribs, her throat tightening at the thought of his faded glory. Ragnar would never rejoin his pack. That chapter had closed forever. But in its place, they offered him a reprieve from the relentless cold and hunger that had stalked his final days. At the research center, his arrival marked a tense beginning. Veterinarians swarmed around him, administering antibiotics to fight lingering infections, cleaning the scars and sores that marred his skin, and providing nutrient-rich meals to coax his body back from the brink. Ragnar lay still in his enclosure. Those first days, a grey heap in the corner, his head resting on his paws as if too weary to rise. The staff moved quietly around him, speaking in hushed tones, their hands gentle but purposeful. Gradually, signs of life returned. In a spacious pen built just for him, he was fed daily. Chunks of meat and supplements slipped through a hatch, and his care became a ritual of hope. That first week, he'd sniff at the food suspiciously, eating only after long pauses. But as days turned to weeks, his appetite stirred, and a faint gleam crept back into his clouded eyes. After a month, Ragnar had regained a measure of strength. He could now shuffle around his enclosure, his gait slow but steadier than before. Occasionally he'd pause to stare out at the snowy expanse beyond the center's walls, the world he'd once ruled now reduced to a distant vista. He knew his freedom was gone. At times he'd lift his head and howl, a mournful, trembling sound that carried the weight of lost days. In his prime, that call had rallied his pack, their voices rising in a wild chorus that filled the night. Now, it echoed, off the concrete, and died in the stillness unanswered. The staff would pause when they heard it, exchanging glances that spoke of both awe and sadness. Elena and Noah made a point to visit him every day. They'd sit on a bench outside his pen, sometimes sipping tea from a thermos as steam curled into the frigid air. other times sketching his form in their notebooks or recording observations. Ragnar grew accustomed to them over time. Where he'd once bared his teeth at their approach, he now settled into a quiet tolerance, even pressing his head lightly against their hands when they reached through the bars. One afternoon, as Elena traced her fingers along his fur, she whispered, "I still can't believe you're here, old warrior." Noah chuckled softly, leaning closer. "He's starting to know us, isn't he? Like we're part of his pack now. What do you think? Has Ragnar found a new kind of home with them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. He was no longer the sovereign of the snowy forests. The days of leading his pack, of racing through the wild after prey, were memories locked in the past. Yet his final chapter spared him the agony of starvation or a lonely death in the ice. He had a place here, small, confined, but warm and secure. The center's staff took to calling him Old King, a title murmured with reverence, a quiet tribute to the ruler he'd been. On his final night, the cold was unrelenting. Snow lashed against the center's windows, piling high against the walls while the wind wailed like a restless spirit outside. Ragnar rose in his pen, his movements slow but deliberate, and tilted his head to the unseen sky. With what strength remained, he let out one last howl, a faint, resolute cry that trembled in the air, a farewell to the wild that had forged him. Elena and Noah, keeping watch that night, heard it through the storm. They stepped closer to the glass, their breath fogging as they watched him, eyes glistening with unspoken grief. The old king, once a titan of the forest, spent his final moments far from nature's cruelty, cradled in the fragile warmth of human compassion. By dawn he was still, his spirit slipping away into the endless snow, a legend carried off on the poor wind. Have you ever encountered a tale like Ragnar's where the wild meets a human touch? Share your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. And so, in the heart of Canada's frozen wilderness, the saga of Ragnar, the Old King, drew to its quiet, poignant end.